I had been looking forward to my birthday all week, the way someone looks forward to a quiet Sunday morning or the first sip of coffee after a long night. I had imagined the evening over and over in my head, picturing my family gathered around the table, the familiar clatter of dishes, the warmth of candlelight reflecting in everyone's eyes. My son had promised to cook my favorite dinner, and my daughter-in-law had insisted on baking a cake from scratch. I wanted everything to be perfect, a gentle celebration of my life, the years I had lived, the memories I had made. The smell of roast chicken and fresh bread filled the air, mingling with the subtle scent of vanilla from the cake she had prepared. It should have felt comforting, but deep down, I had a little knot of worry I couldn't shake. As I walked into the dining room, I noticed the way everyone had arranged the chairs just so. The table set with our finest plates and sparkling glasses. The wine glimmered in the soft light, a deep red that reminded me of so many birthdays past, each one marked with laughter and a few tears, with toasts and stories, with moments that had seemed small at the time, but had grown into memories I carried like treasures. My grandchildren were already at the table chattering and giggling, their excitement palpable. I smiled at them, tried to match their energy, even though a part of me felt older than ever tonight, more fragile than I liked to admit. Everyone took their seats, and my son poured me a glass of wine. He leaned over and whispered, "Happy birthday, Mom!" And I felt a warm rush of love that almost made the knot in my chest disappear. Almost. My daughter-in-law, however, seemed determined to make her presence known tonight, flitting around with a mix of nervous energy and what I could only describe as a forced cheerfulness. I had tried to like her when she first joined the family, had tried to see her good qualities, but something about her always left me a little uneasy. Maybe it was the way she seemed to want to control everything, even the way people should feel at our table. The first part of dinner was normal enough, with small talk and the usual teasing between siblings. I tried to laugh along, tried to focus on the comfort of my family around me. But every once in a while, I caught her glance, that little twitch of a smirk, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't understand why, but something in her attitude made me feel like I was an outsider in my own home. I brushed the thought aside, telling myself I was being silly. After all, it was my birthday. Nothing bad could happen tonight, I thought. Then, just as the main course was being served, she stood up, clinking her glass lightly to get everyone's attention. My heart skipped a beat and I tried to muster a polite smile, thinking perhaps she was going to say something nice. Instead, with that overly cheerful smile plastered on her face, she raised her glass and said, "To the last meal before Grandma moves out." The room froze for a split second. Then, as if on cue, laughter erupted. Loud, easy, cheerful laughter. The kind that makes everyone feel included except me. I forced a laugh too, because I didn't know what else to do. But inside, my heart dropped like a stone into cold water. I could feel my cheeks heating up. A mix of embarrassment, shock, and something heavier, something I couldn't quite name. I looked around the table, at their laughing faces, trying to figure out if anyone else noticed how wrong it felt. My son laughed along with everyone, a little louder than normal, and I caught a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. But he quickly swallowed it, hiding it behind a smile. My grandchildren giggled, oblivious, thinking it was just another silly joke. And I realized that everyone had missed it, the cruel edge behind her words. It wasn't funny, not to me. I wanted to speak, to tell her that it hurt, that the words cut deeper than any birthday cake could sweeten, but the words caught in my throat. I felt a lump forming, a heavy, suffocating weight, and all I could manage was a polite smile and another forced laugh. I tried to focus on the wine, the flickering candlelight, anything to distract me from the sting of what she had said. But it lingered, echoing in my mind like a warning I wasn't ready to hear. As the dinner continued, I found myself observing her more closely than usual. noticing little things I had ignored before, the way she tilted her head when she spoke, the way she seemed to measure every word, every gesture, as if the room belonged to her and not to me. I realized with a sinking feeling that my presence tonight was not celebrated, not truly, not in the way a family should celebrate a birthday. It was tolerated, packaged neatly with a laugh that was meant to mask discomfort, meant to make me think it was all just a joke. By the time dessert was brought out, I was quiet, barely touching my cake while the rest of the family talked and laughed. My son tried to steer the conversation toward happy memories, reminiscing about the birthdays of years past, but I couldn't focus. Each word felt hollow, like it belonged to someone else's life. I watched my daughter-in-law's face, waiting for her to say something else. Something else that would remind me that I was not the center of this celebration. That my place here was temporary. The cake was chocolate, my favorite kind, with little candles flickering in the soft light. I made a wish, of course, because it felt wrong not to, even though my heart wasn't in it. I wished for nothing grand, nothing impossible. I wished for warmth, for understanding, for my family to see me, not just see me, but truly see me in a way that mattered. I blew out the candles, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something miraculous to happen. But of course nothing did. The laughter resumed, louder this time, and the weight in my chest returned, heavier than before. After dinner, I helped clear the dishes, my movements automatic, almost robotic. I listened to their conversations, their jokes, their teasing, and felt more and more like an intruder. No one asked if I wanted help carrying anything. No one asked how I felt. No one asked if I was okay. It was my birthday, and yet I felt invisible, as if the day belonged to everyone else but me. I smiled politely when my grandchildren tugged at my sleeve, tried to join in their excitement, but even that felt forced. My heart wasn't in it. It was somewhere else, somewhere quiet, nursing the sting of her words, wondering how something so small could feel so sharp. By the time the evening was over and everyone began to leave the dining room, I felt exhausted, drained in a way I hadn't expected. My son hugged me tightly, whispering, "I love you, Mom." And I held on to that, clinging to it as if it could anchor me to something real. I tried to smile at my daughter-in-law, tried to ignore the flicker of smugness in her eyes, but I couldn't help the small, almost imperceptible shiver that ran down my spine. I realized then that birthdays weren't always about happiness. Sometimes, they were about realizing that the people around you might not see you the way you thought they did. That laughter could hide cruelty, and that even the people you loved most could be blind to the pain they caused. I went to bed that night feeling older, quieter, more alone than I had in years. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just a joke, that I was overthinking it. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I knew that something had shifted, that the laughter at the dinner table had drawn a line I wasn't sure I could cross again. And as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder if my presence in that house, in my family's life, was already becoming a memory, something temporary, something that was not truly wanted. The morning after my birthday, I woke up with a strange emptiness I couldn't shake. It wasn't sadness exactly, but a hollow sort of ache that lingered in my chest like a stubborn shadow. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, replaying last night in my mind. The smell of the roast chicken, the laughter, the cake, it all seemed distant now, like a dream I had no part in. I tried to push it aside, to tell myself it was just a joke, a clumsy attempt at humor that had gone too far. But the words, "to the last meal before Grandma moves out," kept echoing over and over, sharper each time I remembered them. I went about my morning routines mechanically, making tea, feeding the cat, watering the small plants on the windowsill. But my mind wasn't on any of it. It kept circling back to that moment at the table. Why had she said it? What was the real meaning behind it? Was it really just a joke? Or had there been an unspoken message in her tone, in the way she smiled when everyone laughed? The thought that my family might be planning to push me out slowly, to make me feel unwanted in the place I had called home for decades, made my stomach twist in knots. Later that day, my son came into the kitchen, trying to make conversation as if everything were normal. He poured himself a cup of coffee, leaned against the counter, and asked about my morning. I wanted to tell him, to pour out my feelings, to explain how deeply that toast had hurt me. But the words caught in my throat. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he hesitated as if he was afraid of what I might say. Instead, I smiled politely and told him it was fine, that I had a good birthday. He nodded, but I could see the flicker of worry in his eyes, a shadow that mirrored my own unease. Throughout the day, I found myself replaying small moments in my head, searching for signs I might have missed, trying to understand the truth behind her words. I remembered the way she had smirked just slightly before the toast, the way she had surveyed everyone's reactions as if expecting approval. I thought about the subtle comments she had made in the past, small digs disguised as jokes, moments where she had insinuated that I was a burden or too set in my ways. And suddenly, the toast didn't feel like a one-time slip. It felt like a culmination, the loudest signal yet that my presence was tolerated rather than cherished. By afternoon, I had retreated to my favorite chair in the living room, a worn recliner that had molded to the shape of my body over years. I wrapped a blanket around myself, pulled my feet up, and stared out the window at the garden my hands had tended for decades. It should have felt comforting, the familiar green leaves and the soft rustle of branches in the wind, but all I could focus on was the emptiness in the house, the feeling of being out of place. Even the sunlight streaming through the curtains seemed too bright, too exposing, as if it were highlighting the fact that I no longer belonged. The children came in and out of the room, their laughter and chatter bouncing off the walls, oblivious to the storm inside me. I tried to join in, tried to smile at their antics, but the effort felt hollow. Every giggle, every shout, reminded me of the toast, of the laughter that had followed it, and of the unspoken truth it hinted at. I felt a sharp pang of fear. What if this was only the beginning? What if the subtle exclusion, the quiet hints of disapproval, were signs of a slow, deliberate attempt to push me out of my own home? When my daughter-in-law came in later, carrying a stack of dishes from last night's dinner, I noticed the careful way she moved, the way she avoided my eyes for just a moment before looking up with that overly bright smile. She didn't speak, just moved around efficiently, clearing plates, stacking glasses, as if she were running a restaurant rather than visiting family. I wanted to say something, to ask her why she had made that toast, but I couldn't. I swallowed, hard, forcing myself to nod politely when she passed, and she smiled, just a fraction too long, as if she knew something I didn't. By evening, the house had grown quieter. The children were off playing, and my son had gone out to run errands. I was left alone with my thoughts, a silence that was both comforting and oppressive. I poured myself a small glass of wine and sat, in the dim light of the living room, letting the liquid burn down my throat as I tried to steady my nerves. I thought about my life, about the years I had devoted to this family, about the moments I had sacrificed for their happiness. And I realized, with a deep, sinking ache, that all of that might not matter, that my presence, my love, my history with this family could be dismissed so easily with a single careless toast. The thought was suffocating. I tried to distract myself, flipping through old photo albums, tracing the faces of my children and grandchildren with trembling fingers. I smiled at some of the pictures, the memories of birthdays past, of family vacations, of moments that had felt so alive at the time. But the memory of last night kept creeping back in, twisting the sweetness of the photographs into a bitter reminder that things had changed, that perhaps the world I had built with so much care, the life I had nurtured, was no longer mine to claim. Sleep came fitfully that night, a series of half-dreams and vivid memories where laughter turned to whispers of exclusion and smiles masked disdain. I woke several times, my heart racing, my mind caught in a loop of fear and doubt, and as I lay there staring at the dark ceiling, I realized that birthdays weren't always about joy. Sometimes they were about clarity, about seeing truths you might have been avoiding, truths that hurt more than anything else. The next morning, I resolved to confront my feelings, to speak up, to reclaim some sense of peace. But the moment I saw her in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with that same precise, measured efficiency, I faltered. My throat tightened, my courage dissolved, and I realized that confrontation was harder than I imagined. Her presence, her smile, her very way of existing in the house seemed designed to undermine me, to remind me that my voice could be silenced with a glance, a laugh, a toast. And so I stayed quiet, retreating into my routines, into the familiar rituals that had always grounded me. I tended the garden, watered the plants, cleaned the house, all the while feeling the invisible pressure of her gaze on me. Every movement, every word felt calculated, as if I were constantly being evaluated. The warmth I had once felt in my home had become a fragile veneer, one that could be shattered by a single careless comment, a single joke at my expense. By the end of the week, I felt exhausted, emotionally drained, and more aware than ever of the precariousness of my place in the family. The children still loved me, of course, and my son tried to shield me from the tension, but it was impossible to ignore the undercurrent of judgment, the subtle exclusion, the quiet reminders that I might not belong as firmly as I had thought. And as I sat alone one evening, looking out at the darkened garden and the flickering lights of the house, I realized that last night's toast had changed something fundamental. It had shifted the balance, made me see my family not just as loved ones, but as people capable of dismissing me, of treating my presence as temporary, as optional. The fear settled in then, a slow, creeping dread that made my stomach churn. What would happen next? Would they push me out gradually, like a tide eroding the shore, until I had nowhere left to stand? Or would they continue to hide behind polite smiles, behind laughter and jokes, while quietly reminding me that I was no longer fully part of their world? I didn't know. And that uncertainty, that gnawing doubt, was worse than any outright cruelty. I realized that in order to protect myself, I needed to reclaim some sense of control. I began thinking about small ways to assert my presence, to make it clear that I was not to be dismissed so easily. It wasn't about confrontation, not yet. It was about finding quiet strength, about reminding myself that my life, my history, my memories were valuable, no matter what anyone else thought. And yet, even as I made these plans in my mind, I couldn't shake the lingering sting of her toast, the way it had turned laughter into something sharp and cold, something that reminded me of the fragility of my place in this family. And so, the week passed, a mix of quiet routines and lingering tension. I smiled when necessary, laughed when required, but inside, I was constantly aware of the unspoken message that hung in the air, like a shadow following me wherever I went. Every glance, every tone, every small movement felt loaded with meaning, and I realized that birthdays, no matter how joyful they were meant to be, could expose the cracks in relationships, the hidden resentments, and the subtle ways people reminded you that you were not truly at the center of their world. By the time the weekend rolled around, the house felt different, like the air itself had grown heavier, I noticed the quiet ways in which things had shifted. My daughter-in-law moved with even more purpose, as if staking a claim on every corner of the house. My son tried to keep everything balanced, polite, as though nothing had happened. But I could see the tiny hesitations in his gestures, the way he would glance at me and then look away, unsure of how to navigate the tension. And I, for my part, felt more like a guest than the mother, the grandmother, the person who had poured decades of love and care into this family. Saturday morning began with the usual bustle. The children were up early, playing in the living room, their laughter bouncing off the walls. I poured myself a cup of tea and tried to join them, but every shout, every giggle reminded me of last week's birthday toast. I felt a prickle of irritation mixed with fear. It wasn't just about the joke, it was about the idea behind it, the suggestion that my presence was temporary, that I might be seen as a burden rather than a part of the family fabric. Later, when my daughter-in-law offered to help me with breakfast, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to push her away, to claim my own space, but another part feared causing a confrontation. I agreed politely, letting her take charge, and as she moved around the kitchen, I noticed the subtle ways she organized the utensils, the meticulous arrangement of plates, the careful placement of cups, as if she were silently saying, "This is my domain." I felt my chest tighten. How had things changed so quickly? I had thought this home was mine too, filled with years of memories and warmth, but now it felt like the lines of ownership were being redrawn before my eyes. The children were cheerful, oblivious, and I envied them. They could move through the world without the weight of suspicion, without the nagging fear that their presence might not be entirely welcome. I wanted that freedom, even for a moment. I wanted to laugh freely, to feel that simple joy that had been so effortless for them. But every glance, every movement, reminded me that I was older, that I was seen differently, and that even my birthday, a day meant to celebrate me, could be co-opted into a display that left me feeling small. By afternoon, the house had settled into a strange rhythm. My son retreated to his study, and my daughter-in-law began tidying the living room, a task she approached with a precision that seemed to underline her control. I wanted to speak, to assert my presence, to remind everyone that I had lived in this house, that my memories mattered, that my role was important. But I didn't. I sat quietly, letting the tension build in my chest. The laughter and conversation that had once brought me comfort now felt like a reminder that the world was moving on, and I might not be a central part of it anymore. As evening approached, I found myself walking through the garden, seeking solace among the familiar plants and flowers I had tended for years. The roses were blooming, the lavender releasing its gentle fragrance, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of peace. But even here in the quiet of my own creation, I could feel the shadow of last week's toast pressing in. The idea that I might be leaving, even if only in jest, had planted a seed of uncertainty that no amount of sunlight could erase. That night, dinner was quieter than the day before. My son tried to keep the mood light, talking about small victories at work, sharing funny anecdotes, attempting to draw laughter from the room. The children giggled at his stories, but I noticed the careful way they cast glances toward their mother, seeking her approval, and I realized that the balance of attention had shifted. The laughter felt less organic, more like a performance, and I felt even more like an observer than a participant. My daughter-in-law's smile was precise, her tone perfectly measured, and I could sense the subtle way she wielded control over the room. I tried to engage, to share a story from my past, a memory of a birthday long ago, but the response was polite at best, quickly redirected toward something else. I felt my words shrink inside me, my voice fading as the conversation moved around me. I realized then that it wasn't just about her toast. It was about presence, about authority, about being seen and acknowledged. And I could see clearly that my position in this family, while protected by love in some ways, was no longer unquestioned. After dinner, I helped clear the dishes quietly, moving through the kitchen like a shadow. My son thanked me, gave me a small hug, and retreated again, leaving me alone with her meticulous tidying. I felt an urge to speak, to assert something, anything, to reclaim a sense of place. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I cleaned silently, feeling the weight of history pressing down alongside the weight of uncertainty. Later that night, as I sat alone in the living room, I reflected on my life in this house. The walls held decades of memories, laughter, tears, celebrations, quiet moments of comfort. And yet, in a single evening, a single toast, everything had been called into question. I thought about the years I had devoted to raising my children, to creating a home that was welcoming, to nurturing relationships that I had assumed were permanent. And I realized that permanence was an illusion, that family could shift, roles could change, and even love could be complicated by subtle power dynamics I hadn't noticed before. Sleep came fitfully. I dreamed of last week's birthday dinner, of the laughter, of the toast, of the way her words had landed like a stone in my chest. In my dreams, the house was smaller, the rooms tighter, and I was constantly aware of her presence, moving through the spaces with quiet authority, while I shrank into corners, trying not to be noticed. I woke in the night, heart pounding, and lay awake for hours, tracing the contours of the shadows on the ceiling, thinking about how quickly familiarity could turn into unease. By morning, I resolved to be more cautious, to protect myself from further discomfort. I moved through the house with measured steps, engaging where necessary, retreating where possible. I tended to the garden with extra care, watered the plants, pruned the roses, as if asserting ownership in the spaces where her influence was less. I talked to the children, shared small stories, and tried to laugh freely, even though a part of me remained tense, anticipating the next moment when control or authority might be subtly challenged again. Throughout the week, I noticed small things, tiny shifts in tone, fleeting expressions, subtle comments designed to remind me of my position. Each one felt like a test, a measurement of how far I could go, how much space I could claim without overstepping invisible boundaries. I began to anticipate them, preparing myself mentally for the next subtle slight, the next joke at my expense. And I realized that living in this family, in this house, was no longer just about love. It was about navigating the invisible rules, the silent hierarchies, the unspoken expectations that had quietly shifted. And yet, even in the tension, there were moments of warmth. My grandchildren still ran to me, hugged me tightly, shared their small victories, their little worries, their laughter. Those moments reminded me that my presence still mattered, that I still had a place in their hearts, even if my daughter-in-law was subtly trying to redraw the map of the household. I held on to those moments, savoring them, letting them remind me that I was still part of the family, that love was still here even if complicated, even if tested. By the end of the week, I was exhausted but alert, aware of the delicate balance in the house. I knew that the coming days would require patience, strategy, and resilience. The birthday toast had been more than a joke. It had been a signal, a shift, a reminder that even in familiar spaces, control and influence could change hands. And as I sat quietly in the living room, sipping tea, listening to the faint sounds of the neighborhood, I understood that my role in this family, while deeply rooted, was not immune to challenge. The house was mine, in memory, in love, in history, but the dynamics within it were evolving, and I would need every ounce of awareness and strength to navigate the days ahead. The days following my birthday had settled into a fragile rhythm, one that felt both familiar and precarious at the same time. Each morning, I woke with a mix of anticipation and dread. I never knew what subtle shift awaited me, what comment might carry a hidden sting, what glance might cut deeper than words. Even the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window seemed to carry a weight now, highlighting small imperfections, casting shadows in corners I used to take for granted. The house felt different, altered by a single toast that had drawn invisible lines around me, lines I wasn't sure I could cross without consequence. I tried to reclaim my sense of control by establishing routines. I spent long hours in the garden, pruning roses, tending to the herbs, washing the windows, as if by making the space orderly I could assert my presence. But no matter how much I worked, no matter how carefully I polished surfaces or arranged flowers, I could feel her influence creeping into every corner. My daughter-in-law moved through the house with effortless precision, and I noticed the subtle ways she redirected attention, steering conversations, guiding the children, her smile always just a fraction too bright, her laughter just a little too sharp. One afternoon, as I was arranging flowers in the dining room vase, she appeared beside me, offering a comment about the arrangement. "Maybe try putting the roses in the corner. It'll open up the space more," she said, her tone casual but carrying that unmistakable edge. I wanted to argue, to say that I liked them centered, that I had always arranged them this way, that the room had always been mine to decorate. But instead I forced a smile, muttered a quiet agreement, and moved the vase to the corner. Even small concessions felt like victories to her, and I resented that she could claim them so easily. Later, my son came into the room, leaning against the doorway with a cup of tea. He watched us in silence for a moment, then said softly, "Mom, you don't have to change anything for her." His eyes held concern, but he didn't push. I appreciated his words, but I could see the hesitation behind them, the subtle tension that had grown between us all since the toast. His love was clear, but even love couldn't erase the unspoken dynamics that had taken root. As evening approached, the children returned from playing outside. They were full of stories, their laughter bouncing through the house, unaware of the tension that had settled over it. I tried to immerse myself in their joy, to smile freely, to join in their games, but the shadow of last week's toast lingered. Every joke, every comment, every glance seemed like it could carry an undertone, a reminder that I was not fully welcome, that my place here was fragile, dependent on subtle permission I hadn't realized I needed. Dinner that night was quieter than the birthday meal, but not for the better. My daughter-in-law orchestrated the conversation with careful precision, asking questions, steering responses, subtly highlighting her control. I noticed the way my son followed her lead, trying to maintain harmony, and I felt a pang of isolation. I tried to contribute, offering stories from my youth, memories of birthdays long ago, but her responses were polite, fleeting, and then the conversation moved elsewhere. My voice, once comfortable and central in these family moments, seemed to shrink with every passing sentence. After dinner, I retreated to the living room, curling up in my favorite chair. The room smelled faintly of lavender from the garden, but even that comfort couldn't erase the unease I felt. I thought about the toast, about the laughter that followed it, and about the subtle ways she had been asserting herself ever since. I realized that the small gestures, the controlled movements, the polite redirections, were part of a larger pattern, a quiet campaign to establish her authority in a space I had long considered mine. The thought made my chest tighten, a mix of frustration, sadness, and a fierce determination not to be pushed aside without resistance. The children came to me eventually, climbing onto my lap, seeking attention, sharing stories, and their joy reminded me of why I stayed. They still loved me, still sought comfort and guidance from me, and those moments were precious, untainted by the undercurrents swirling around the adults. I held them close, listening, laughing, and for a while I felt anchored. But even in these fleeting moments of connection, I couldn't ignore the reality of the dynamics at play, the subtle exclusion, the quiet reminders that my role in this family was being tested. Night fell, and I found myself reflecting on years past, on birthdays that had felt simpler, warmer, filled with laughter that didn't carry double meanings. I remembered the effort I had put into raising my children, into building a home, into creating memories that I had hoped would last a lifetime. And now, a single toast had destabilized everything, revealing cracks I hadn't anticipated, tensions I hadn't recognized, and a subtle power shift that I was only beginning to understand. Sleep was uneasy. I dreamed of her smile, the precise way she moved through the house, the soft authority she wielded without a word. In my dreams, I was always on the edge, trying to navigate the house without upsetting her, trying to hold on to my place while she silently dictated the rules. I woke multiple times, my heart racing, and lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how quickly dynamics could shift, how easily familiarity could give way to uncertainty. The following days brought more subtle tests. She would ask for help with minor tasks, giving instructions in a tone that felt polite but controlling. She would suggest changes to my routines, question small choices, and redirect attention in ways that reminded me that my voice no longer held the weight it once had. And I noticed how my son responded, quietly, diplomatically, often leaving me to negotiate these subtle challenges on my own. It hurt to see him caught in the middle, to feel that his love for both of us created a silent barrier rather than a shield. I began to consider how I could respond without creating confrontation. I reminded myself that assertiveness didn't need to be loud or aggressive. It could be quiet, steady, unyielding in small, deliberate ways. I focused on the garden, on the children, on the spaces where I still held influence. I cherished their presence, their laughter, their innocent love, and I reminded myself that my worth was not determined by anyone else's approval. Yet even with this resolve, the weight of the toast lingered, a constant reminder that my place was being subtly questioned. And then one evening, as I sat quietly in the living room, my daughter-in-law came to me with a question about family photos. Her tone was friendly, her smile wide, but I sensed an underlying intent, a subtle measurement of how I would respond. I answered politely, providing the information she needed, and she smiled, nodded, and walked away. I felt a mixture of triumph and frustration, triumph for maintaining my composure, frustration for the constant need to measure every response, to guard against small slights that were never explicit but always present. By the end of the week, I realized that I had adapted, at least partially, to this new dynamic. I moved through the house with heightened awareness, balancing assertiveness with diplomacy, engaging when appropriate and retreating when necessary. I found comfort in small victories, in moments where my influence and presence were acknowledged, however subtly. And yet, the memory of that toast remained. A sharp reminder that laughter could mask exclusion, that love could coexist with tension, and that even in the warmth of family, one could feel the cold edge of being tested. As I prepared for the next week, I promised myself that I would not let this situation define me. I would cherish the children's love, nurture the spaces I still controlled, and quietly assert my presence in ways that mattered. The toast had opened my eyes, revealed the fragility of perceived security, and shown me that even in families, roles could shift, power could change hands, and respect was not always guaranteed. I would face this challenge with grace, patience, and awareness, holding on to the knowledge that my place in the family was built on decades of care, love, and history, things that no toast, no smile, no subtle power play could erase entirely. The next morning, I woke with a lingering sense of unease. Even after a full night of sleep, the memory of my birthday toast pressed against the edges of my thoughts like a shadow that refused to move. I went about my routines as usual, tending to the garden, watering the flowers and arranging small bouquets in vases around the house. But there was a quiet tension in every movement. Even the sunlight, which had once brought me comfort, seemed to highlight the sharp edges of my discomfort. The house, my home for so many years, felt suddenly unfamiliar. The children burst into the kitchen, bright-eyed and full of energy, and for a moment, I allowed myself to be distracted by their chatter. They talked about small adventures, silly games, and school stories, filling the room with noise that should have felt comforting. But every laugh, every question, every glance at their mother reminded me of the underlying currents that had shifted since my birthday. My daughter-in-law was always present, hovering just enough to guide, redirect and subtly assert control, her smile never faltering, her tone always cheerful, but carrying a subtle authority that felt deliberate. When my son appeared in the kitchen, he greeted me warmly, but there was a hesitation in his eyes, a shadow that mirrored my own fears. I wanted to speak to him, to share my feelings about the toast and the unspoken messages it carried, but I held back. The words felt heavy, risky, as if voicing them aloud might disrupt a delicate balance I didn't yet fully understand. So I smiled politely, engaged in light conversation, and kept my emotions carefully contained. Later that day, as I moved through the living room, I noticed how she had subtly rearranged the furniture. The chairs were angled differently, cushions fluffed in a precise, deliberate order, and the small touches of her style were now evident throughout the space. I wanted to argue, to reclaim the arrangement I had always preferred, but the thought of confrontation made my chest tighten. I realized that in this house, even small gestures were battlegrounds for control, and every day required vigilance and careful navigation. By evening, I was on edge. Dinner was approaching, and I could feel the tension in the air before the meal even began. The children were cheerful, but I noticed the way they glanced toward their mother for cues, a subtle but unmistakable shift in attention that reminded me of my own precarious position. I tried to focus on the positive, the warmth of family, the comfort of shared meals, but the memory of her birthday toast lingered, a sharp reminder that my presence could be treated as optional. Dinner itself was a delicate dance. My daughter-in-law led the conversation, guiding topics, asking questions, and subtly asserting authority. I offered stories and memories, carefully phrased and measured, but her responses were brief and redirected quickly, as if she were testing boundaries. My son tried to mediate, balancing politeness with support, but even he seemed constrained, caught between his wife's subtle dominance and his love for me. I felt my voice shrinking, fading into the background, and the familiar sense of belonging I had once taken for granted was eroding. After dinner, I withdrew to the living room, seeking solace in the quiet. I reflected on the years I had spent nurturing this family, creating a home, and fostering memories. And I realized with a sharp pang that all of that care and love had never guaranteed safety or permanence. Even in families bound by love, dynamics could shift, roles could be challenged, and the sense of security one assumed could be disrupted by a single comment, a single gesture, or even a subtle smile. Later that night, I was sitting alone, sipping a small glass of wine, trying to steady my thoughts. I thought about confrontation, about speaking up, about asserting my presence, about challenging the subtle control she had established. But each scenario played out in my mind with complications. My son caught in the middle, the children confused or upset, the household tension rising. I realized that strategy and patience were essential, that a direct confrontation could backfire if not handled with care. Sleep was restless. I dreamed of last week's birthday dinner, of the laughter that had followed the toast, of the way her words had cut through the room like a sharp edge. In my dreams, the house was transformed, every familiar corner filled with subtle traps, every gesture observed and evaluated. I woke multiple times, heart racing, and lay awake in the quiet hours of the night, thinking about how quickly comfort could turn into unease and how easily familiar surroundings could feel foreign. The following days were a test of endurance. She continued her subtle assertion of control, guiding the children, organizing tasks, and redirecting attention in ways that reinforced her influence. I adapted, learning to navigate these subtleties, asserting myself quietly when necessary and retreating when discretion required. Each day was a delicate balance between maintaining my presence, nurturing my relationships, and protecting my emotional well-being. One afternoon, she asked me to help with the children's homework, her tone friendly but insistent. I agreed, but as we sat together at the table, I noticed the way she positioned herself, the way she subtly took over explanations, corrected my suggestions, and guided the conversation. I felt a mix of frustration and determination, a realization that I needed to be aware, to assert boundaries, and to protect my role in the family without escalating conflict. Later that evening, my son and I shared a quiet moment in the kitchen, away from the others. He expressed concern, gently asking if I was feeling comfortable. I reassured him, carefully choosing words that balanced honesty with diplomacy. He nodded, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. Love for both of us, trying to mediate tensions, and the desire to keep peace. I felt a mixture of gratitude and sorrow, recognizing that even those who love us most can be constrained by circumstances beyond their control. By the end of the week, I had developed a quiet resilience. I moved through the house with awareness, measured my words carefully, and held on to the small victories, the laughter of the children, the moments when my influence was acknowledged, the private spaces where I could assert control over my routines. And yet, the memory of her toast remained a sharp reminder of the fragility of perceived security, of the subtle ways power could shift in families, and of the need for vigilance, patience, and strategic thinking in navigating these dynamics. I began to plan small ways to reclaim my sense of authority, not through confrontation but through quiet presence. I focused on nurturing the garden, sharing stories with the children, and maintaining rituals that reinforced my importance in the household. Each small act was a declaration. I was here, I belonged, and my history, my love, and my care for this family could not be erased by a single toast or a smile. The birthday toast had been more than a joke. It had been a catalyst, revealing underlying tensions, exposing subtle power shifts, and challenging my assumptions about permanence and belonging. I realized that navigating family life required awareness, resilience, and the ability to adapt without losing oneself. And as I sat in the quiet of the evening, watching the children play and the house settle around me, I felt a renewed determination. I would protect my place, assert my presence, and hold on to the love and memories that were mine, even if subtle forces tried to undermine them. And so, the days continued, a careful dance of observation, patience, and quiet assertion. The house remained the center of my life. My children remained my anchors, and my resilience grew stronger with each passing moment. The toast had shaken me, yes, but it had also awakened a clarity, a sense of purpose, and a determination to maintain my rightful place in a world that sometimes seemed eager to redraw the lines without warning. The following week, I woke with a sense of quiet determination. I had spent days navigating subtle tensions, measuring my words, asserting my presence in small ways, and nurturing the children and spaces that reminded me I still belonged. But deep down, I knew it was time to confront the unspoken reality, to address the underlying currents that had been shifting in my family. Not with anger, not with accusations, but with clarity and calm, because I could no longer ignore what had been quietly eroding my sense of place. That evening, after the children had finished their homework and my son had retreated to his study, I called my daughter-in-law into the living room. She came with a bright smile, her tone light and casual, but I noticed the subtle tension in her posture. a flicker of surprise in her eyes as she realized this was not a routine conversation. I invited her to sit, gesturing to the sofa, and she did, tilting her head slightly, clearly curious about what I wanted to say. I began carefully, my voice steady but soft, recounting the birthday toast. Not angrily, not accusingly, but honestly. I told her how the words had landed, how the laughter that followed had felt exclusionary, how the implication that I might move out had shaken me deeply. I watched her closely, noticing the small signs in her face. The slight narrowing of her eyes, the tilt of her lips, the faint pause before she responded. I continued, speaking of my love for this family, the years I had devoted to creating a home filled with warmth and care, and how the toast had highlighted a fragility in my role that I could no longer ignore. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then she spoke, carefully measured, her tone still polite but tinged with an unfamiliar honesty. She explained that the toast had been meant as a joke, a playful comment, not a statement of intent or reflection of her feelings. She admitted softly that she had not considered how it might affect me, that she had underestimated the impact of her words. I listened, the weight in my chest lifting slightly as she spoke, but I remained cautious, aware that words could be carefully chosen yet still leave an emotional sting. I shared my perspective further, gently but firmly expressing the need for respect and consideration, for acknowledgement of the decades I had poured into this family. I explained that while love could be taken for granted, my presence, history, and contributions deserved recognition, not just in thought, but in action and in the small, everyday ways we treated each other. I could see understanding growing in her eyes, a subtle shift from defensiveness to empathy, and I realized that the first step toward resolution was this honest conversation, grounded in vulnerability and clarity. Afterward, the tension between us began to ease. Over the next days, I noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She was still precise, still organized, but the sharp undertone in her words softened. She sought my input more frequently, engaged in conversation with genuine interest, and allowed me to assert myself without redirection. Small gestures, a shared laugh, a gentle smile, a moment of attention, started to rebuild the trust and balance that had been disrupted. My son noticed too, quietly expressing relief that the household tension had eased. The children, as always, remained anchors of love and joy, their laughter filling the house, reminding me why I had endured the subtle challenges. I began to feel that the house was once again a home, not just a collection of rooms and memories, but a living space where relationships were nurtured, acknowledged, and respected. One evening, a week later, the family gathered again for dinner. The atmosphere was warmer, more natural, less calculated. The children chattered freely, my son shared stories, and my daughter-in-law, while still organized and precise, allowed the conversation to flow without imposing control. As we raised our glasses in a quiet toast, without jokes, without hidden implications, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since that fateful birthday. The toast was simple, an acknowledgement of presence, of family, and of love. I realized then that resilience, clarity, and gentle assertiveness had been key. By expressing my feelings honestly and calmly, by maintaining my sense of self while navigating subtle power dynamics, I had reclaimed my space in the family. I understood that love alone does not prevent misunderstandings, that family dynamics are complex, and that one must balance patience with courage to preserve relationships and maintain respect. Later, after the children had gone to bed, I sat in my favorite chair with a cup of tea, reflecting on the past weeks. The fear and tension that had once dominated my thoughts had been replaced with clarity and quiet satisfaction. I realized that families are living systems, constantly evolving, and that challenges, even painful ones, can become opportunities for growth, understanding, and stronger bonds. In that quiet moment, I felt a renewed sense of belonging. The house was still my home, filled with memories, love, and history. The laughter of my grandchildren, the warmth of my son's care, and even the subtle shifts in my daughter-in-law's approach reminded me that relationships require attention, dialogue, and sometimes courage. I had faced the discomfort, navigated the tension, and emerged with a stronger awareness of my value and place within this family. And as I sipped my tea, listening to the faint hum of the neighborhood outside, I smiled quietly to myself. Birthdays, I realized, are not always about celebration. They are about clarity, reflection, and sometimes confrontation with truths we have ignored. They remind us that love is layered, that respect must be nurtured, and that even when subtle forces challenge our place, we have the power to reclaim it through patience, honesty, and resilience. The house, once tense and uncertain, now hummed with a gentle warmth. My family, despite the trials of the past weeks, felt connected, more aware of one another, and more respectful of the space and history we shared. I realized that life is full of moments that test our strength, that reveal hidden tensions, and that require courage to navigate. And in facing those moments, we find clarity, resilience, and a deeper understanding of what it means to belong. As I finally closed my eyes that night, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had faced the sting of a careless toast, the subtle assertion of control, and the quiet undermining of my place in the family. And yet, through patience, honest dialogue, and the steadfast love I held for my family, I had reclaimed my presence, reinforced my value, and ensured that the warmth of our shared home remained intact. I knew that challenges would come again. Life is never without them. But I also knew that I had the strength, the clarity, and the patience to face them. My place in this family was not defined by jokes or fleeting comments. It was built on decades of love, care, and shared history. And as I drifted into a restful sleep, I carried with me the certainty that I belonged, that I was valued, and that even in moments of tension, love and resilience could restore balance and peace.